Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final Urban Living webinar before the main event, the live event, which is taking place next week, and more info on that later. Today, we're going to be talking about the burgeoning build-to-rent sector and how operators and developers can differentiate their offer in an increasingly crowded market. My name's George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media, and we are a publisher of B2B news websites for the hospitality sector, and we also run events and awards. Now, this webinar series is sponsored by Flywire. Flywire is a global payments enablement software company on a mission to deliver the world's most important and complex payments. We use our Flywire advantage, a combination of next-gen payments platform, proprietary payment network, and vertical specific software to help our clients get paid and help their customers pay with ease, no matter where they are in the world. So thanks to Flywire, and you can find out some more information about them in the chat. So today's session is going to last around an hour. We're going to have 45 minutes of panel discussion followed by Q&A. And we'd like to make it as interactive as possible, so please do submit questions using the chat function or the Q&A function in Zoom. There'll be a recording of the session sent to everybody by email in the next couple of days. I just wanted to run through a bit of context before we get started on the conversation. So these are some quotes that I've seen in various industry media about the build-to-rent sector over the last few weeks, and some of this did strike a chord with me. So the first one from Jed McPartlin, Managing Director of Ascend Properties. It's clear that build-to-rent is becoming the go-to choice for developers, with projects popping up in both major cities and smaller regional towns. And then Anne Malone from Wise Living said, we're seeing growing numbers of families and older couples opting for purpose-built rental properties in the suburbs. So it's not just younger professionals living in city centre apartments. And then finally, an S&P Global report into the investor outlook on the sector says financial investors could ultimately own a third of the nation's rental stock, according to estate agent Savills, as depressed interest rates bolster the appeal of assets able to generate rising income over a large number of years. And then these are some stories that we've run on our own service department news website. And these just give quite an interesting snapshot of, I mentioned earlier that this has become an increasingly crowded market, and you can see the kind of players who are coming in. So John Lewis, Lloyds Bank, Greystar, the US multifamily giant, looking at acquiring a UK operator. And then you've got Apache Capital, which is already very active in the space, looking at single family rentals, which is something that we'll come onto shortly as well. So we've got a great panel of contributors here. The slide looks a bit odd to me. I can't see the contributor slide on my screen now. I know it should have come across, but I'm going to ask you guys if you could all just introduce yourselves one by one, tell us what you do, and then we'll kick off with the conversation. James, would you like to go first, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, George. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, delighted to be on this panel. Thanks for having me. By way of introduction about myself, LaSalle, so I'm an asset manager within the European Living and Hospitality Asset Management team. In the UK, the team is responsible for managing a portfolio of about £2.5 billion with around 13,000 beds across hotels, healthcare, students and residential sectors. On the BTR and residential side, specifically LaSalle have been an investor since around 2015. And currently we manage roughly 2,000 beds across the UK in locations including Manchester, Birmingham, London and Leeds, with a variety of operating structures as well, including direct lets and lease models. So yeah, so thanks very much and good to be here.
Lovely, thank you, James. And Ben, welcome to you.
Thank you, thanks for inviting me to join. I'm Ben Yexley, I'm head of build to rent here at Flatfair. We are the leading deposit alternative in the build to rent space. We currently work with about 50% of the operational sites in the UK, We work with the likes of Greystar, Fizzy, Invesco, Ad Living, Atlas Residential, many, many more. And of course, we'll be working with Darian on the call today and Native in the new year as we launch on their scheme in Woking, hopefully early next year. Our core focus here at Flatfair is a number of things. We're looking to offer future residents a choice in how they secure their property, whilst changing the way that deposits are dealt with, reducing the admin that's needed from your end, adding extra protection to you, and reducing that barrier to entry for residents. And I'll talk about that a bit today on the webinars. I think it's a core element of standing out from the crowd. So really looking forward to being on this call today, discussing many different topics about how Build to Rent can stand out from the crowd. And I'll be coming at this from a supplier, a partner, but also just a general Build to Rent nerd who studies the industry and has an opinion about all sorts of stuff. So thanks for inviting me.
Great stuff. Thank you, Ben. And finally, Darian, welcome to you.
Hi everybody, so I'm Darian, I'm from Native Residential, so I've been in Build to Rent now for 4.5 years roughly, having come from Get Living and then basically mobilising and stabilising number 26 in Croydon, along with LaSalle obviously for Native, so I was the community manager there. And then I'm now working on our newest launch, which is called The Marches in Woking, and working really closely with Ben on how we bring in kind of new technology and flatfair into the offering there. And obviously for those that don't know, obviously Native's roots are kind of really, really geared towards service departments and the service delivery that we offer. So we're in a really exciting place right now with our Build to Rent side of the business, which is now called Native Residential. So I'm really, really excited to kind of go through some of the points today, and hopefully we can have a nice fun interaction together. And like Ben said, I'm also quite a Build to Rent geek, so really, really excited to hear kind of what everybody has to say.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, and thanks to you all for joining us today. So let's kick off by asking you each in turn, as you're all coming at this from a slightly different angle, let's ask you each in turn what you think are the main short and long-term effects of the pandemic on Build to Rent. James, would you like to kick off with that?
Yeah, sure. It's a pretty broad topic. I'll try and not hog too much time, but I think you know, from our portfolio, the short-term impacts, you know, we really saw were very much around kind of restricting access to a lot of spaces within the schemes, which was really challenging for us from an operational point of view, but also managing residents, because you know the amenity space is what, and the community as well, is what draws a lot of people to Build to Rent. You know, occupancy wise and demographics, we definitely saw that kind of initial exodus of young professionals as well, whether that was because people were on furlough, job losses, those students. You know, we in some of the locations we had a lot of people working in hospitality as well. You know, obviously well-being challenges as well on the short term. You know, I think longer term effects is undeniable that flexible working is here to stay. I don't think we'll see any extreme at either end of the scale, whether that's full-time working from home or full-time in the office. I think it will be flexible, but it's undeniable. I think that occupancy and Build to Rent schemes is going to be higher throughout the day than perhaps we saw pre-pandemic, and you know, we'll have to adapt to that. You know, I think we're seeing people return to city centres, which is great, but also I think community engagement seems to be more important now than ever. The events that we've been hosting post-pandemic, or you know, with that restrictions have allowed, have been really well received, even more so than pre-pandemic. So I think people are really kind of raring to get back into those communities. I'm sure Darian will have lots to talk about on that front.
Thanks, James. Do you want to pick up on that topic then, Darian, while we're talking about community and how the pandemic may have affected it?
Yeah, so I think I definitely agree with the things that James said. It went from a kind of really special place where everybody was so open to any ideas in terms of events. They would always kind of participate. and you'd always see the same residents over and over again, and very quickly they kind of just created this amazing community in number 26 where, you know, they would share skills with each other and all the kind of core principles of what community should be. And very quickly then it became a situation of closing the amenities, you know, issues around the rental payments. How do we help the vulnerable residents? Can we kind of cross skill with the residents to see whether there's people who are vulnerable and what help that they need with other residents? So it was like completely different challenges. So occupancy for us, it did drop a little bit, but actually we were still able to lease throughout that period through, I guess, the use of digital. So I kind of diverted my attention to how we can look at, you know, virtual viewings, FaceTime, etc. But I think for me, the biggest challenge was around, you know, you have your teams who are no longer working from site. So you have to deal with that. So you're working remotely and trying to manage a site team and trying to manage residents. And then you've got the mental health element of that as well. So, you know, mental health of staff was the first thing. And then obviously the residents as well. So it was very different. It went from like one amazing special community to actually one that I think, you know, when you look back, the residents kind of all went through it together with us. And I think as long as we were communicating about what we were all going through, you know, in a roundabout way, actually we managed to keep that community really quite close-knit. And like I say, we didn't see a huge impact on our occupancy, and we also didn't see a huge impact on our rent. So I was quite keen not to bring the rents down because we were confident in our community, basically. And I think that goes back to what James was saying, in that really, if you get that bit right, you know, that's what people want. They want to be part of something now more than ever. And I think with so much change that's happened and kind of, you know, this kind of whole unsettled climate that we're slowly coming out of, you know, I think it's definitely what people need, and they want to be helpful to each other. They want a bit more of a kind of transparent service level as well. And yeah, I guess the main way for me to explain it is they want to feel part of a family. It is, you know, whichever way you look at it, that's what I see a lot more of. And kind of looking at that a bit further, how do you do that? And for me, it's quite interesting because there's so many great ideas out there at the moment, but what we found worked really well was just the basic small things. So the basic events, you know, just natural ways to bring people together, and they would be there and they would love it. And it's just simple, basically. So yeah, and then I think just to kind of divert slightly, I think for me, what I'm now seeing is a slightly different challenge, because obviously we're kind of about to launch our newest scheme, which is kind of our first out of London, really, for Build to Rent South in Native right now. So we're looking at our new scheme in Woking, which has its own completely different community dynamic. So for me, and kind of the things I enjoy, this is perfect because it's got a really strong kind of town centre feeling about it. And within that, you've got some amazing people who, you know, if we do it properly, we can really make sure that they are part of the marches and part of the brand that we're going to deliver. So I'm really excited, but we've also got to adapt to what has happened. So looking at the work from home requirement is a big thing that's on my list right now, and not just, you know, adapting to that, but thinking, how can we make working from home amazing for people? Because we have to do it now. It's not an option anymore. You know, it's part of life. So how can we make it really, really good? And
talk about the kind of physical design of the buildings. Actually, we'll move on to that. I think the work element is going to be really important. But you've also got quite a big development pipeline at Native. Do you know how the pandemic has affected that in terms of timescales? Has it set you back? I mean, I know, you know, it's not just been the pandemic. There's materials shortages, there's skills shortages. How is that all looking?
Yeah, so right now it's a personal challenge for the marches, because we were due to actually complete, I believe, kind of August time, as part of kind of sectional completion there and start our install. But then that got slightly delayed back to October, and now we're actually looking at kind of Q1 next year. And the reason for that is very much around issues with supply chain, labour and COVID. So it's definitely had an impact.
Yeah, okay. Ben, you've got a great overview of the sector, working with so many of the players. From where you're looking, what have been the main effects of the pandemic, and where do you think the sector is at in terms of its recovery?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that when you look at Flatfair, we work across the residential markets as well. As we basically, if you let it, we can help you with it. But what that means is that we've got quite a good overview of what's happening elsewhere in other markets, and we can directly compare that to our build-to-rent operators, the investors we speak to regularly that are interested in knowing how that all plays out. And I think back to 2 years ago when everybody was very doom and gloom. You know, we were expecting 50% of our tenants to up and leave, and the rest to be struggling to pay their rent. And thankfully, although the general market, we work with hunters and Spice Hart that deal with tens of thousands of tenancies across the country. Even in their marketplace, they've not seen the doom and gloom that we were predicting. But it does please me, especially as I work in build to rent myself, to say that build to rent has fared a lot better than the rest of the market. Rent rolls have remained very, very high. And occupancy rates, north of 95% in all the schemes that I work with, which is unbelievable if you think about the predictions that were coming through a couple of years ago. I genuinely think the guys here, James and Darian, have just touched on a couple of the examples that build to rent operators are able to offer to tenants to solve what could have been a disastrous situation. And then lots of the operators we work with, Fizzy, Greystar, they're offering residents the opportunity to upgrade. So actually they've seen tenants moving into 2 beds and repurposing that bedroom into a working from home space. It's interesting to see that now when we talk to developers, we work with funds, and as they're building out their sites, they're now putting in place communal working spaces. And that's off the back of lots of surveys, lots of research showing that although residents do like working from home, they still like the office environment. So how can we do a bit of both of that and create a community around working from home? So I think we are moving further away from that PBSA style of design around, here's your home, here's your 1-bed apartment, and moving much towards that community aspect that sat at a WeWork at the moment, sort of WeWork community, that sort of office space at home. But I think, we touched on where does that lead to from an investor's point of view. And I think the investors I talk to have seen quite a lot of confidence that despite a really tough market, we're still holding high rent rolls, we're still holding high occupancy rates. Although there might have been some rental holidays, some deferred rental payments involved, we, as an investor, you've not lost out here in what really was the worst market anybody could have predicted for the build to rent industry that is relatively, new and immature in the UK. So I think from an investor's point of view, this has created pent up demand. We can't develop quickly enough, and tenants are looking to move into the cities. They're looking to get back to a metropolitan lifestyle. They're looking to get back to being close enough to work from the office, even if it's 1 or 2 days a week. They're looking to be close enough. And I think that's really creating a bit of pent up demand for build to rent, both from a resident's point of view, but also from an investor's and a developer's point of view. We can't build quick enough now that the gates are open. So I think, although it's been an interesting couple of years for us, and a time period that none of us expected, I think it's actually showing a very positive light to the build to rent industry as a whole. And I think the demand is coming through. And we're seeing it with more and more investors from different countries different funds coming in with different models and different opportunities pushing through. So from my point of view, having seen the rest of the market, we've come through this very, very strong. I think we should all be proud of the work that we do in the build-to-rent industry to make that happen.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. James, do you think this demand that Ben's talking about is partly a result of a sea change in attitudes towards rental and home ownership? I mean, obviously in continental Europe and the US, it's quite normal to live in a rental property, in some cases your whole life. Where, you know, in this country, we're something of an anomaly in that respect. But do you think that is changing?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, massively. And I think there's kind of several factors at play there. You know, firstly, it's been well publicised for many years now that home ownership is just becoming increasingly challenging, with, you know, wage growth lagging behind house price growth, tightening mortgage lending criteria. Help to Buy has just been downgraded and is going to be phased out, I think 2023 entirely. And I think I was reading a slightly depressing article that I think the average length of time for someone to save up a deposit to buy a house in Greater London area was 11 years. Slightly shorter for the regions, but not by a significant amount. I think it was still about 8 years. And I think people have got to be thinking about the sacrifices that you have to make in order to save for that deposit. And if those are sacrifices that you're making in, you know, potentially that, you know, might be the prime of your life, is it worth it? People have got to be asking if it's worth it, that home ownership goal. And I think running along the same side as that argument, I think the perception around renting is changing as well, as, you know, sectors like build to rent come up and the rental offering just becomes much more professional and much sleeker. I think the PBSA market has kind of helped create that almost new standard of accommodation. And, you know, we still see it tends to be a slightly younger demographic currently in build to rent, and they do seem to be following on from that PBSA product. And I think, you know, on the continent, there is probably slightly more tenant friendly, you could say, than in the UK. And I think there's historically been that perception that renting in the UK, you have fewer rights as a tenant, and, you know, there's a degree of uncertainty. But I think with the build to rent model, you know, we want people to stay for longer periods in the buildings to really kind of foster and contribute to that community. So, you know, that level of uncertainty shouldn't really be there. But also the way technology has kind of contributed to that seamless way of living and that ease of living. You know, we've invested in residence apps in our buildings where, you know, you can report all your maintenance issues, you can have direct chat with site staff, you get notifications when your parcels are delivered, you can arrange a whole myriad of services, dry cleaning, dog walking. You know, and you compare that to the traditional, you know, rented sector, which I think a lot of people still think about when they think about renting. You know, you might think of private landlords who are unresponsive, or, you know, maintenance issues go a long time without being fixed. So I do think there's a slight change in momentum towards renting, just as people, you know, look to alternatives to home ownership, you know, which they've, you know, in some instances have been forced away from. But also, I think, you know, we've just come through a really tumultuous period, and the flexibility that the rental model affords is, you know, a lot of people put a lot of value on that. You know, by owning your own home, it's not a very flexible model. If you need to, you know, if you have a sudden change in circumstance, it can take quite a long time to, you know, to exit from your property. Whereas, you know, we've seen tenancy lengths being offered really vary. I mean, some as low as 3 months. Traditionally, we see residents wanting a 6-month break option, but, you know, they'll often stay longer than that. And I think across the portfolio, the average length of stay tends to be around the 12 month plus mark. So yeah, there's that flexibility point, which I think particularly now, there's still a degree of uncertainty, isn't there? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in winter. Working from home, working in the office, it feels like the dust hasn't quite settled on that yet. So yeah, there's definitely benefits in renting from a flexibility point of view.
And while people are demanding flexibility in all areas of their life. Do you think the average length of stay for a build to rent tenant is going up?
I think so. I mean, I need to look into the data on some of our schemes. I mean, our scheme in some of our schemes are, you know, they've only kind of just reached stabilisation. They're newer builds, but I mean, people have got to be renting for longer than before, just because of the same issues I've mentioned around home ownership. And there's some really great stats around there about, you know, why it's important to foster a sense of community. I forget who said it, or I'm probably pinching it from someone else, but I think it was if they figured out in one scheme that if you knew one other person in the scheme, you're 50% more likely to renew. And I think everyone's nodding, they've heard it before, but if you know two people, you're 90% more likely to renew. So yeah, I think it's almost part and parcel. If you create that community, people will stick around for a longer period of time.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, James. Dheraen, are you seeing people moving into your buildings who are teetering between maybe putting a deposit on a flat or going to a build to rent building with lots of amenities and services?
So it's, for me right now, I'm not actually working on a live scheme, so it's a bit tricky to kind of answer that in terms of data behind it. But I think what's nice for us now with the marches and the client that we're working with there, which is Woking Borough Council and Moy Allen, is that we've actually got quite a unique offering around how renters can earn credits towards their first property deposit if they're a first-time buyer. So it's quite a huge sort of like sustainable life cycle of a resident offering that we're doing. I won't go into it in too much detail because we're just ironing out the details of it, but the crux of it are that you will need to stay within the community for a minimum of 2 years, and you then have to contribute well to that community. And there's various rules and regulations and, you know, tips that we give to make sure that that happens. But what it does is it encourages really good behaviour from residents. So we're really excited to see that, because for us it gives us a minimum of 2 year, you know, secured tenancy while we stabilise. But for an applicant or a, you know, a young family, it gives them the longevity of a new home in the future.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll keep an eye on that one. So let's talk about the physical product then and how that is evolving. You mentioned families there, and you know, traditionally we think of kind of young couples, young professionals, perhaps not families so much. And we've also mentioned now that providing workspace, whether it's in the units themselves or communally, is becoming more important. So Darian, how are your schemes evolving in terms of design? What are the main changes that you're seeing?
Yeah, so the latest sort of like market analysis we did, we found that the demographic, particularly for our new scheme, is around 25 to 40-year-olds. So it's actually grown quite a lot compared to Croydon. And I think the reason for that, particularly with Woking, is looking at kind of who the large employers are in the area. So you've got the likes of McLaren and Capgemini and lots of others. But what that means basically is, in terms of the space, we've looked at the need for catering to that. So initially during the development phase, it wasn't the case, but now it's kind of looking at how to adapt what we've got in order to make sure that it's suitable. So it's looking at how we've, like, for example, we've incorporated a sandpit in our rooftop garden for the children, and kind of like a section, and giving places a little identity for like homework clubs or, you know, that sort of thing. But I think generally the easiest way to explain it is we've just looked at everything, revised everything, where the plug sockets are. Is this going to give maximum use of this space for, you know, the peak time when everyone wants to work in here? It's just looking at it a bit more pragmatically and thinking small changes, but it will just get the most out of the space, basically.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, you're obviously got a good overview of lots of schemes going on. What would you say are the main design trends in the physical product?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If I think back to when I first got into build to rent, about 3 years ago. Sorry, I've got a funny light going on here. If I think back to when I first got into build to rent around 3 years ago, it was very much a sort of copy of the sort of PBSA style market in planning and working out your investment. And I think over the last sort of year and a half, we've started to see a bit more sort of focus on, you know, what is the client's need and how can we cater to what is now a much broader set of potential clients coming into the scheme. So we see, you know, not just a studio with a living room and a kitchen. We've now got studios with larger living rooms with working spaces involved and all that sort of stuff coming through. So I think it is just a maturing market, and as that market matures, we learn, we grow, and we develop more bespoke buildings. What I'm quite interested to see is how the physical products that were initially built early on will continue to perform and demand those returns, as you know, the whole point of this webinar is standing out from the crowd and making sure that you are, you know, that build to rent asset that is more desirable than the classic, you know, private rented scheme down the road, the 2 up, 2 down around the corner. You know, we are competing for the same tenants. We're competing for the same residents. Although we call them residents, they're all tenants. And we are competing in the same market as your 2 up, 2 down the road. You're competing against other build to rent operations. So it'll be interesting to see how these very, you know, classic build to rent style buildings start performing. But then when we look at, you know, we talked about, earlier, we talked about the attitudes of home ownership and renting and how they're evolving regionally and nationally. What we start to see nationally is, of course, there's an interest in single family housing, and that coming from a build to rent aspect. What we think and what lots of reports are saying is that in the regions, build to rent isn't as of interest as it is in the cities. But I personally think it's because the product isn't there. You know, we are going to be competing naturally against classic home ownership in the regions, and we're going to have to stand out. And I think it is going to be really important to educate and really detail every single aspect that makes you different from being a homeowner around the corner when it comes to single family housing and renting in the regions.
I can probably say something about the early schemes, and you know how they need to adapt, because I think we had one of the first schemes in Manchester, which has obviously gone on to be kind of the cradle of build to rent in the UK. And you know, when we opened that one, there was a gym in the, you know, communal gym for residents, you know, but it wasn't very big, and to be honest, it probably hadn't been a huge amount of thought that had gone into it. Obviously, as the, you know, the wider Manchester market has become so much more competitive, we actually took out 2 apartments, which are, you know, perhaps the less attractive apartments anyway, because they were on the ground floor overlooking the kind of communal gardens, and expanded the gym and you know, properly invested into it, because that seems to be, when we kind of survey residents on what their priorities are from a design and amenity point of view, gym is always very top on the list. But yeah, I think as particularly in some of the cities where, you know, like Manchester, for example, where there's a lot more competition and build to rent is pretty established, you know, we are having to make sure that we remain competitive and investing into the schemes. You know, the aesthetics of the apartments for rental is very important, so making sure that the you know, the furnishings are of a, you know, good, high enough quality but also durable. Yeah, I mean, I find that there, you know, you've seen it in the States, I think, as well, with the amenity war, amenity race, however you want to look at it. And you know, there's some fantastic amenities now in schemes which, you know, really kind of blow you away. And I think they're fantastic because it's great marketing for the build to rent sector. You know, people look at it and think, oh wow, like that's available. I am slightly cautious in terms of just making sure that you properly research your residents and your demographics and really nail down what people want and need, because ultimately, you can't avoid affordability when you're talking about build to rent, because for a lot of people, it's the alternative to home ownership. And ultimately, people are going to have to pay for the amenity that goes into the building. So it's a fine balance. And it's also going to be very location specific, I think, on some of these design points, because, a lot of the urban build to rent, they're in locations where there is already a lot of amenity. And I think it's quite important to make sure that you complement rather than compete with the amenity in the area.
So let's say, for example, the scheme you just mentioned, the early scheme in Manchester, which had just one small gym. If that building was starting to come out of the ground now, what amenities would you expect to see in it?
So interesting. We've opened a building in Birmingham just before the pandemic, actually. So it was a bumpy ramp up stage, but that one we've put a very strong gym in. It's something you would expect to see in more of a commercial gym offering. It's very spacious. We've got a really spacious kind of co-working residence lounge area, which I think is a very flexible space as well. So it can kind of be adapted to different times of the day depending on what events are going to be organised. We've got a Halloween fancy dress competition coming up, which it's about 200 people signed up to take part in that, which will take place in that same kind of co-working lounge area. I think as well, the parcels delivery side is definitely one that we kind of factor in now into new developments. I think one of the schemes we had, it's nearly 40,000 parcels delivered in 1 year. And if you think about the staffing side of things, you don't want your staff and concierge staff dealing with packages all day. You want them dealing with your residents. So, coming up with storage solutions, but also technology solutions to make sure that that's kind of as seamless as possible. But still, I still think, being quite sensitive to your location and your residents when choosing amenities.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Darian, let's talk about other, not physical amenities, but services that residents are demanding now. I had a quick look at your video earlier, and little dogs featured quite prominently in that. So obviously, pet friendly seems to be a must. What about things like F&B, childcare, that kind of things? What are people expecting you to supply now, or to be able for them to access?
Yeah, I think there's a few things there. I think the first one, just to go back to James, in terms of the parcel storage, is like the most required thing, I think, right now. So it'd be interesting to see, kind of, especially over Christmas times and opening of the marches. Obviously, it's got quite a different layout for us, so I'm working through that at the moment, but it is such a massive thing. But in terms of like services and F&B, so in campus, which is our biggest scheme in Manchester, obviously where I am today, we're really looking at kind of our ground level. So we've got a whole F&B offer in there, which is taking a little bit longer just to get the right people in because of COVID, but we've got like the most independent people from all around Manchester who are starting to kind of occupy those units. So basically, I think this is quite a term that I've heard quite a lot recently, which is that whole 15-minute city. And how do you give people that? So it needs to be constantly fresh, whatever it is, whether it's food, whether it's a service, it needs to be fresh, it needs to be new, and it needs to be relevant. And then the other thing is kind of looking at travel methods as well. So this is something probably a bit more for Woking and where we are, but the sustainability element of travel methods for people. So they don't have to have a car, they can join our car club, they can hire a bike, it's 5 minutes away and it's safe. So yeah, there's slight changes, more towards generally, like I try to kind of categorize it in convenience, sustainability, and kind of that's how you then have your community. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah,
hopefully.
It does, and kind of linked to that, what about programmed activities? Obviously, James mentioned the Halloween party, but what kind of things do you do for your residents?
So again, because I'm not on a site, I'm working on kind of what I will be doing. But I am quite interested at the moment in kind of a concept called like here and now. So I think because everybody's gone through quite a crazy COVID time, and then you've also got working from home tied into that. So it's like there's no differentiation between your working day and then your home life. So looking at, you know, small things that we can do that allow people to just chill out, touch base with either themselves, with crafts, with something that really allows them to be back in the moment, enjoying kind of the surrounding area, enjoying other residents and getting to know people just quite naturally, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to pick up on something that Ben mentioned earlier and come over to you, James, for a second. And this is the rise of the single family and suburban build-to-rent sector. It seems like there are quite a lot of big players showing a lot of interest in this space now. How do you see that particular market growing? And is that something that you guys are looking to get into?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something where we're looking at quite closely. You know, I think ultimately investment portfolios, you always want them to be diversified. And I think, you know, we recognise the fact that the housing crisis in the UK isn't just affecting one single demographic of people. You know, not everyone wants to live in an urban location. You know, there are a lot of reasons why people want to live in the suburbs, whether that's, you know, whether to do with crime rates or schools or access to green spaces. I think what will be really interesting is how the affordability point is addressed on suburban build to rent, just because I feel like, you know, if people are going to be renting for longer, people still need to be able to save for pensions. I think the amenity will probably look quite different on suburban single family housing as well. It will probably, you know, be more of an onus on community engagement outside of the home, whether it's, you know, cycling clubs, sports clubs, dog walking, etc. But also maybe integrating education, healthcare on the wider scheme. I think the challenge will be creating something that is, you know, aspirational and appealing, but also affordable to a wider portion of the population.
Do you think we might get to the stage where rental schemes are truly multi-generational? So you might have some PBSA in there, you might have some what we would describe as typical build to rent, but you could also have some kind of senior living units with an element of medical care provided. Could that all work in the same development?
I mean, I'd love for that to happen. I don't see why it can't happen, because we already have students, young professionals, middle-aged people, older people, all retirees, all living in the same buildings. And I don't really see, I mean, I see retirement living, for example, as very much kind of the next big chapter in build to rent. I don't really see why it has to sit completely separate from, you know, more traditional build to rent. I think obviously from a development point of view, a lot of thought will have to be given to, you know, the design, and there are some great architects out there already kind of building up, drawing up excellent kind of multi-generational, multi-use schemes. You know, I think diverse communities are always going to be a better functioning community, and I don't think, you know, older people want to be, you know, segregated from society. I think students can sometimes get a bad reputation in terms of noise and party, but given how much money they're spending on education nowadays, I think you're seeing a little bit less of that. I was actually at a really impressive scheme in Guildford a few weeks ago, where it's PBSA right next to, they called it considered living. There's more kind of a bridge between PBSA and build to rent, and they were side by side, but both functioned really well, because, you know, you have the security of having on-site team with a student 24/7, but you've got communal areas. And I think just from an operational point of view, you just have to be quite, you know, you have to be quite careful, and you have a good operator in place to make sure that, you know, communities are following certain rules and guidelines, that the broader community can kind of all get along quite seamlessly. But yeah, I'd love to see that, and I don't see why it's not possible given the mix of demographic that we already have in some of these buildings.
I think students are a lot more civilized these days than they were when I was at university, which is probably a help. Ben, I saw you nodding along there. Is this multi-generational idea something that you're sort of witnessing the start of?
Absolutely. I was nodding along and laughing. The reason I was laughing is I've got a bet running with one of the investors in one of our core schemes that we're working on at the moment. And the bet is that by the time that either of us hit our deathbed, that we will have seen a testimonial from somebody that was born in a build-to-rent scheme, stayed within the same operator and went through their PBSA property, took their own jump, moved away from home to another city within the same operator and moved into sort of senior living towards the end of their life. And that running bet, although it's a bit of a joke, is quite a big move forward from where we were 3 or 4 years ago, where it was really unheard of. The idea of single family housing was way off. And I think that's been accelerated by completely supply and demand. I mean, we just don't have enough homes being built. The money that wants to build these homes is very interested in getting a return on that, and build to rent has proven that they can produce very good returns. So I mean, if you look at JLL's report, I think it came out sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago. They predict that 4.5 million people will be living in urban environments. 4.5 more million people will be living in urban environments over the next 10 years. But we're just simply not building enough homes to deliver that. But I also think this is a supply and demand issue from an investor's point of view. And this investor that I have the bet running with agrees with me that there's not enough brownfield sites, there's not enough planning and development that we can get through for these investors to continue building these large build-to-rent schemes in metropolitan areas. And so they're looking at diversifying their investments, as James said, and putting that money into ways of delivering homes, getting that return, and securing, solving the problem that we've got, which is not enough housing. So I think it's supply and demand, but from both angles, both from future tenants, but also from investors and the money that wants to solve this problem.
You're going to have to live to a ripe old age to see that bet settled, but I hope you do. Before we move on to some questions from the audience, we've had a couple. Please do submit your questions, folks. And I should have mentioned earlier, actually, that the LinkedIn contact details for all our panelists are in the chat if you want to continue the conversation with them afterwards. But let's move on to the tech side of things, and we'll stick with you, Ben, for a minute. So let's talk about tenant-facing tech. What are operators providing them, and what do they expect, and how is that making a good build-to-rent development stand out from a bog standard rental property?
Of course. Well, I'd say I'm probably best placed to sort of comment on that initially, and I'll hand over to the experts around other technology. Flatfair is a deposit alternative, but we came at this from a technology-based angle, and the reason that we did that was so that we can work on what residents expect and what future tenants are going to expect when they move into their properties. So we're moving away from stuffy renting. We've seen shorter rental periods. We now have a serviced accommodation deposit alternative that we're working with a couple of suppliers, so that we can protect 1 month to 7-year tenancies with a deposit alternative. And yet traditional deposits create quite a lot of administration, headaches, there's lots of red tape, lots of legalities around it. But what we've done with Flatfair is catered the product to what we see the future tenant wanting to see. And with just focusing on the deposit alternative, I know it's not, if you look at our competitors, it's probably not a technology product. And it's a small cog in a very big sea of thousands of different amenities and benefits that you can offer residents. But just looking at my marketplace deposit alternatives, I joined Flatfair 3 years ago, and when I joined, we were probably offering deposit alternatives across all deposit alternative providers. We probably covered about 0.2% of the population that are renting in the UK. We reckon that we're probably covering around 8% as a was a supply market in 3 years, and that continues to grow. We're working with 50% of build-to-rent operators that just see a deposit alternative, a choice of how you secure your home, as a standard option, where it used to be an amenity, it used to be a marketing benefit. Now it's become part and parcel of what we should be doing, what we should be offering residents in order to compete. So perhaps I'm not best placed to say stand out from the crowd, because it's becoming a standard requirement of residents. It's now a searchable term on the portals. So in terms of technology, we developed Flatfair to be a technology product so that we can work with the likes of Native, working with their integrations with RealPage. We work with referencing providers so that we can create a seamless booking journey. So we work with Spike and Home People. So Appo, who work on behalf of Invesco, they have a seamless booking journey that includes our deposit alternative referencing, all passed through a straightforward funnel. So you don't have different paper-based bookings, so that you don't have 3 different portals sending you invitations to sign up to different systems. And although we talk about technology, we're going to focus on the basics. We in Build to Rent are competing against traditional rentals, other Build to Rent schemes, and we're looking for the same client that might be interested in those properties, and we've got to stand out enough by doing all of these things well in order to secure that tenant that is potentially saving if they go down the road, but we'll get a better service, a better community, a better experience by the technology that we pick and we work with.
Thanks, Ben. James, you mentioned a guest app. What does that offer? What functionality does that have?
Yeah, so the residents app is there really to just ensure that the residents' experience is as seamless as possible. It really helps from an operation point of view, because it's a direct line in with each of the residents. I mean, they're fairly flexible, as I understand. I mean, I'm not a coder by any stretch, but I think you can add capacities to it as well. So yeah, you can report all your maintenance issues on the app. You can communicate directly with site teams. You can arrange for services like dry cleaning, dog walking, cleaning as well. We've got we use a company called Ping Locker as well, and some of our schemes, so that you get notifications on parcels deliveries. But also, you can team up with service providers in the local community and do that through the app, offering discounts to residents. So yeah, I mean, I'd say it's very much kind of a fluid offering, so it can kind of adapt to residents' requirements. But it's very much there to make the residents' experience as seamless as possible, and also it's massively helpful from an operations point of view.
Mm-hmm. And Dheraen, have you got something similar in place at Native?
Yeah, so we've kind of developed the Native model with RealPage, and we've using their app functionality called Active Building. It is really good. It's very kind of flexible. You can skin it, kind of white label it per scheme that you're working on. But I think going back to what Ben was saying, it really helps you to deliver the basics really well. So as an example, the maintenance, you can see very visually on there from the back end, from a management perspective. You can see timeframes, you can see colour coordinated visuals of how well things are going, which jobs haven't been done. But also you can see like a resident review on that maintenance job there and then. So it's extremely intelligent. But I think for me, I think the resident app's fantastic, but I would also just kind of really reiterate that it's only as good as the content and the information that goes on it.
Yeah, okay, great stuff, thank you. I've got quite an interesting question here from Mike Stapley. James, maybe we could start with you for this one. Mike says, while financial issues are leading more people to rent who can't get their foot on the housing ladder, is the basic desire to own a home or have something to pass on to family members waning away as a social trend? I lived in Germany and no one cared that they rented all through their lives, the very long leases even becoming part of the inheritance. Do you think we will ever get to the stage where we have a European scenario where your lease could actually be something that you pass on to the next generation of your family?
It's a very good question. I think with me having an eye on European markets as well, I think the cultural differences are really interesting, and a lot of it goes back it's all in history really, and depends on social reform and liberal policies across different countries. I think the UK, the home has always kind of been the castle, and I don't know, that probably goes back as far as the fact you couldn't vote unless you owned land or something. But I think people are almost, the decision's almost kind of being made for them if they physically can't afford to buy. That maybe that pipe dream for owning your own home isn't just not going to be feasible. I mean, also it also depends really on kind of where government policy goes, right, in the UK, because that's anyone's guess at the moment. There's rental reform white paper out at the moment, and I mean, obviously that kind of culture has been created in Germany, for example, born out of a more liberal, maybe more socialist political landscape. So I think we're a long way off that at the moment, but I think for some people it will just be the natural alternative to living with a roof over your head, to be honest.
It will be interesting to see what the government direction once Help to Buy is phased out, as you said, because obviously there has been a huge push to help as many people as possible onto the ladder. But it was almost kind of an artificial stimulus for the new homes market there, and I don't think the government could carry that forever. So it'll be an interesting one to see. We're nearly at the end of the hour. That's flown by. It's been a really good discussion. So thanks everybody for taking part. I'm just going to run through a few slides before we finish. Our next urban living webinar is called Rising Stars, and it's going to be a panel of young entrepreneurs from across the real estate and hospitality industries telling us about their businesses and their hopes for the future. And you'll be able to register for that on the link that's just appeared in the chat. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last webinar before the Urban Living Festival happens in person. We've been really excited about this event for a couple of years. We've had to postpone it 3 times, I think, due to the pandemic. But it's finally happening next week, and we'd like to see loads of you there. It's all about how real estate and hospitality asset classes are converging, very much along the lines of some of what we've discussed today. We are currently offering a 20% discount on tickets, and I think you can see the link to buy yours there. So we'd like to see you, as many of you there as possible as we can. There'll be 3 sessions at Urban Living Festival, which are really pertinent to the build to rent market. This is one of them, digital transformation, improving the resident experience, again, which touches on some of what we've discussed today. Another one about design trends for the apartment and build to rent market, and residential alternatives, looking at build to rent, PBSA, senior living, and so on. Again, which we've discussed today, which may all, we may eventually see all of those in the same development. So we'd love to see loads of you there. It's going to be a great event. If you're interested in sponsoring, please do contact my colleague Katie. Her details are there and also in the chat. Give us a follow across the social channels. We're active on all these. It'd be good to see you there and to get some new followers, and we'll follow you back. Thanks to Flywire for sponsoring the series. You can see their details in the chat. We are going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes with a countdown clock, because there's a lot of information in the chat, so you'll have a couple of minutes to take some notes there. In the meantime, thanks very much to James, to Ben, and to Darian for their insights today. It's been a great session. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully see you all next week at Tobacco Dock. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.